Good evening. It's good to see everyone tonight. It's good that we can gather together and worship our God. We were able to do that this morning. We're able to do it again tonight, and that's certainly a blessing. We're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13 tonight. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. On Sunday nights, I've been looking at 1 Corinthians, and so we're going to continue that study. If we look at the book as a whole, we notice that there are a lot of different issues that are addressed. You could look at two different parts. You look at closed report in chapter 1, and that really extends through chapter 6. It's dealing with issues like division, the fact that the church was putting up with sexual immorality in their midst. They were not opposed to that. They simply allowed that to go on. We see an issue like litigation. They were taking their own brothers to court and suing them. And we also see a matter of, again, sexual immorality. As we move into the second part of the book, we see issues like marriage being addressed, and also a larger section on worship. And so you see meat and idols, and that was not worship to the true God, but the question is, could they eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols? So in false worship. And then in chapters 12 through 14, he looks at worship, or 11 through 14. So he looks at the covering in the first part of chapter 11 and the Lord's Supper in the second part. We are looking at chapter 13, and that comes in a section dealing with spiritual gifts in chapters 12 through 14. So we're going to continue that study. We already looked at chapter 12 last week, and one of the main points we see coming out of that is the fact that we are a diverse group of people as the body of Christ. We come from all different backgrounds. We have all different levels of maturity. There are a lot of differences, and yet we are one body. One body. Paul needs to emphasize that, because if you look at all of the issues that we've addressed, that really hits at the problem. And that is, they are one church together, but they're not acting like a church. They are putting up with sin in their midst. They're suing one another. They're seeking to elevate themselves in various ways. And so they're not acting as a church should. And that continues not only just as they are being together as a church, but in the very worship itself. And so we see in chapter 12, there is a misunderstanding about spiritual things, in particular spiritual gifts. Paul says, I don't want you to be uninformed. They boasted actually about their knowledge. And so Paul here says that I don't want you to be unaware or uninformed about spiritual things or the spiritual gifts. One of the problems we see that comes to the front is that they were pursuing certain spiritual gifts for the notoriety that it gave themselves, or for the way that it made themselves look, instead of in service to the church, which is certainly a problem. We ended chapter 12 with this statement. He says in chapter 12 and verse 31, but earnestly desire the higher gifts, and I will show you a still more excellent way. That more excellent way is going to be love, and we're going to look at that in chapter 13. But love is sandwiched in between chapters 12 and 14. So at the end of chapter 12, desire earnestly the higher gifts. In chapter 14 and verse 1, it says this, pursue love and earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. We haven't fully gotten into that issue about what they are pursuing, but we're laying the groundwork here in chapters 12 and 13. Jessica also reminded me that I didn't really explain very well about the spiritual gifts. So I'm just going to pause here and talk about what we see in chapter 12. And that's chapter 12, verses 8 through 10. Paul actually lists out 9 spiritual gifts. And part of the confusion I may have added to as well is because I pretty well segued into talents and abilities that we have. These spiritual gifts were not just natural abilities that they had or natural talent, something they worked on. But these spiritual gifts were abilities that were provided by the Spirit in what we might think of as a supernatural way. So they might be able to speak in tongues without having studied that tongue. They may be able to interpret tongues without having studied that language. And so we see that these were gifts, abilities that were provided by the Holy Spirit to the first century church. And it was used for the benefit, or it was supposed to be used for the benefit, the building up of the body, as truth was relayed and spread out to many different people. So those are the spiritual gifts. That's what we're talking about. I don't understand spiritual gifts to be in existence today, and so I kind of naturally made the application that we do have the ability to study a language, say, and learn to interpret a language, or we may have the ability to study and devote ourselves, or we may have natural abilities that lend ourselves in certain directions. But it is different than what we see in chapter 12, the miraculous provision of abilities. And so those are the spiritual gifts that we're talking about, okay? As we move into chapter 13, we'll just notice a quick outline. Paul is going to tell us 3 things about love. First of all, love is essential. Love is essential. And this is a message that the Corinthians needed to hear. They were involved in a lot of spiritual activity, but there was something missing from their practice. And Paul says if we do that, if we have this great spiritual ability and are devoted in many ways, but we're missing love, then that certainly is a problem. Secondly, Paul points to the fact that love is active. Love is active. Paul uses a series of verbs to describe what love does. We need to use our words and say, I love you. Husbands, tell your wives you love them, but don't just use your words. Also use your actions. And when it comes to our brothers and sisters in Christ, we need to understand that love is an action. It does something. It does something. And third, we see that love is permanent. Love is permanent. And Paul is going to use that to contrast with spiritual gifts, which are temporary in nature. So that's the outline, and that's where we're headed tonight. So let's notice the first 3 verses. Chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. We'll see in this section, Paul talks about love being essential. He says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Paul is going to envision the spiritual elite as we want to think about them. Who would you think of that is spiritual to the nth degree? Paul seems to ratchet up how big and how mighty this spiritual person is. And he says, you can have all of these things, but if you don't have love, then it amounts to nothing. So notice, I think that they were pursuing tongues in particular, and that's what Paul starts with. He says that if I speak in tongues, and that's speaking in another language, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, This is not just the speaking languages that other people might speak, but he even adds of angels. I think that ratchets it up a notch. There may have also been this view that the ability to speak with angels was kind of a sign of the end times as we were bringing in these other things. And so they may have really sought after the ability to speak with angels. But Paul says, even if I'm able to do that, but if I don't have love, then it profits nothing. I'm just making noise. I'm not building anyone up. You can think of a clanging cymbal or a noisy gong. It just hits, it reverberates, it goes through and creates a noise, but it's not a melody. It's not pleasing to the ear. It's not beneficial in any way. And so Paul says that even if I were to speak with angelic tongues, speak with angels, but I don't have love, it's just a bunch of noise. Secondly, in verse 2, he says that if I have prophetic powers, and he goes on to say, and I understand all mysteries and all knowledge. Can you imagine? We have Bible classes all the time. Norm is telling us a lot of things in Bible classes. There's a lot of things he knows. But I'll speak for himself and for me and anyone else that stands up here. There's also a lot of things we don't know. There's a lot of things we surmise or we just don't have all the information. But here Paul says that if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, can you think of a person like that? That knows it all, not the know-it-all, that doesn't actually, but one that fully has knowledge. Paul says, if I have that and if I have all faith, you see how he's heaping on. You can picture this person that is someone that would certainly be respected. But Paul says, if I don't have love, I am nothing. The third example he gives, if I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, giving is important. It's more blessed to give than to receive. We try to give a portion of what we own, but can you imagine the person that would give up everything they own? Everything they own. The text, though, doesn't stop there, does it? It's not just give away all our possessions and walk away with our health. It says we give up everything we own and we give up our body to be burned. If we were to sacrifice everything, even our life, now that person is certainly spiritually minded, are they not? But Paul says, even if we were to do that, but we were absent of love, then it profits nothing. Let the impact of those words sit with us for a moment. If I were to have all of these abilities, if I was to display this spiritual nature, if I was to display my devotion, but I was without love, it profits me nothing. This is not a 95% deal where I can get most of the spiritual qualities, the Christian qualities I need to have, but leave out love. Paul says it's essential. Love is essential. I'm not sure exactly how to relate this. A lot of these items, I would think of someone that I would truly respect today, but in your mind's eye, who do you most respect? What kind of things are they doing? They're going to church services regularly. They're helping others, maybe making meals. They are devoting their time to the work of the Lord. They're a good Bible student. They have all of this knowledge. You can think of someone that you highly respect for the way that they live their life. Now, if I do all of those things, if I'm active in all those ways and have all of that devotion, and yet I don't have love, Paul says, I am nothing. It profits me nothing. It's good for nothing. Love is essential. And this is a message that's needed for us, is it not? I was taught, I was brought up to try to do the right things, and certainly I should. But it's not enough just to be outwardly devoted. It's not enough simply to go to services and give my time. It's not enough to do a lot of good things. We have to have the right heart and the right motivation. God has always wanted the right heart and the right motivation, has he not? God wants our hearts, our desires, our emotions, all of that is brought to him. And the Corinthians needed to hear this because I think they were a church that was busy and active in doing a lot of things. But they were missing something in their service to God. And that is love. And you see that time and time again. And we know that that's missing because Paul's going to describe what love is. And we see that the Corinthians certainly had a problem with that. So he gives these three examples. I think he heaps upon this picture of someone that was certainly spiritual. But he says, without love, they benefit nothing. None of these are any good. Secondly, Paul talks about, in verses 4 through 7, the fact that love is active. Love is active. As I mentioned as I introduced this, love is more than an expression of words. It's more than a sentimentality. It's more than an emotion. Love demands that we act, that we do something. If I say that I love you, but then I don't treat you well, those two things don't go hand in hand, do they? Paul is going to spend most of his time saying what love is not. But notice there are a few things that Paul says love is. First of all, love is patient. Love is patient. Long-suffering. A lot of times we demand that people have perfection. We don't expect that of ourselves, but we expect that of others. You made a mistake and we want to call them on the carpet, and how dare you? You can't do that. But love is patient. Love endures. Love understands that other people makes faults, has faults, does things that they should not do. But love is patient, continues on. Love is also kind. Love is not hateful or mean, but kind. Seeking someone else's best interest, treating them well, treating them with open arms and hospitality, showing them love, making sure that they are welcome, that they are valued as a person. Love is kind. In a world where kindness is often absent, we need to understand that love demands that we are kind. We also see that love is truth-loving, rejoices in the truth. And so truth or love is not something that has this nice emotion and just wants the absence of conflict. Even if things are going wrong, as long as there's peace and everything's okay, that's not the picture of love. But love is truth-loving and rejoices over the truth. And I actually realized I didn't actually read this text, so I'm going to repeat some of these things, but allow me to read verses 4 through 7, and then we'll jump into what love is not. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. As I mentioned, there are certain things that love is, patient and kind. I can imagine, for some reason, you have a toddler or a young person in your home, and maybe they throw a fit. Maybe they lash out and hit when they get frustrated, and we stop and say, and if you're a parent to a young one, you've said this a lot, we're going to be kind and nice, right? But then we also add some very specific things, right? We're not going to hit, right? We're not going to throw a fit. We're not going to whine. And we point those out, guess why? Because that's the exact action that we've seen at hand. Paul does something very similar. He's going to give a big list of things that love is not, and I think these are things that they particularly needed to hear. So this is a great chapter. You may have this chapter up on your wall, but this is more than a love poem, right? This is more than just an aside unrelated to the argument that says how great love is. It's more than just a poem for a wedding. Now, it can be all those, and that's one of the beauty of this passage is that the situation that Paul applies it to, we see that it's so much broader, and it applies in almost every situation. It's something we need in every context. But my point is that Paul has a very specific context in mind. And so he says that love is not envious, boastful, arrogant, rude, selfish, irritable, resentful. It doesn't rejoice in evil. These are all things I think that you find at the church in Corinth. So let me expand this list a little bit. Love is not, and I think he's going to basically say, like you're acting. Love is not like that. And you may take a taller side. We don't hit. We don't scream. We don't, you're going through the list. So first of all, Paul says, love is not envious. This word jealous can be used in a couple of different ways, in a positive way or in a negative way. In chapter 3 and verse 3, he says, "Are you not acting fleshly like the flesh? Wherever there is jealousy and strife, are you not acting according to the flesh?" That's that word jealousy. Paul's already brought up the fact that they are acting in a jealous manner. They are dividing up into the groups. They're pitting my group against your group, and they're acting in jealousy. It's interesting that when we have a positive sense of jealousy, typically we use the word zealous instead of jealous, and it's that same word in Greek. But this is the word in chapter 12 and verse 31 when he says, "Earnestly desire or be zealous for certain spiritual gifts." Paul says that they're being, in a negative sense, envious or jealous. But love doesn't act that way. It's rooted in selfishness, right? When we are envious or jealous, we want something good for ourselves and not for someone else. But love doesn't act that way. Paul says that love is not boastful. This is the words of the arrogant. Some have suggested this may be related to kind of the sophisticated philosophical language that they might use, this pompous language. And we see that in chapter 1 and chapter 2, where Paul says, I didn't come to you in that manner of speech, but I preach Christ and him alone. And so we see that there may be some reference to their boasting or their pompous, arrogant speech. We see in chapter 8 and verse 1 this reference to arrogance, or we saw there being puffed up, being puffed up. You know, in the wintertime, birds get puffed up, don't you? You see these fat birds, you think, well, they've eaten a lot, and that's not the case, right? It's just that because of the weather, they're puffed up. Sometimes we act puffed up, don't we? We get full of ourselves. We become arrogant. We think that we are the center of the universe. We are the best there is, and everyone else can't even measure up to who we are. Paul says, don't be arrogant. In fact, he says that your knowledge, or your so-called knowledge, puffs up in chapter 8 and verse 1. Don't be arrogant. Here we see the word rudeness. Rudeness. This refers to acting in an indecent way. So in general, we might see this indecency in action. This may also have some sexual overtones. We see in chapter 5 verse 1 that they were putting up with the man that had his father's wife. And even the Gentiles, those outside the church, understood that this was immoral. This was not something that should happen. And so we see this indecent activity, and maybe specifically to sexual indecency. Whether we're talking about it in a general sense or a sexual sense, we understand that love is not involved in that. Whether it be an indecent activity or sexually indecent activity, love doesn't act that way. That's lust. That's just fulfilling self. Love, though, seeks to serve. Love seeks to honor commitments. Love is not rude. We see in the next word here, he talks about selfishness. Selfishness. You might highlight this one. Love is not selfish. The opposite of selfishness, in fact, is love. Love is when we serve others. We don't elevate ourselves, but we elevate others. We seek to do what is good for them, not what is simply good for us. Love is not selfish. We see in chapter 10 and verse 24 that he references their selfish activity, and he's not supposed to act that way. And so he talks about selfish. Irritable is a word that goes along with a lot of these others. There's not a specific reference there that we find, but we find that interactions that are cranky, irritable, that are causing others to be angry because of the way that we're acting. You can imagine that fits in with all of these other words that we're seeing. Love doesn't act that way. I don't know about you, but that one kind of steps on my toes a little bit because I get cranky and irritable. I'd love to say from time to time, but sometimes it's more than just a little bit. But love doesn't act that way. Love is kind and patient. We see that love is not resentful, does not take an account of wrongs. When we forgive somebody, we put that to the side. We allow that to go past. Love does that. Love understands that you make mistakes and we can put that behind us and strive to do better because I'm rooting for you. I want you to do the best. I'm not going to hold it over your head. But far too often we take an account of wrongs. We mark it down in our book, right? And if not a physical book, we put it down in our mind. I know what you did to me. We see that they may have been doing this even with the litigation. Paul says, why not suffer wrong? So they weren't suffering or enduring the wrong. They were encountering the wrong, and maybe they were taking that directly to court. They were keeping an account of wrongs, weren't they? But Paul says, don't be resentful. Don't keep an account of those wrongs and then allow that to shape your attitude. And do not rejoice in evil. And this may have reference to in chapter 5 when they were putting up with, and maybe even more than putting up with, celebrating their openness to allow a man that had his father's wife remain a part of that community without addressing it whatsoever. There was a cancer and a sin that was killing the body of Christ, and they were overlooking it. And they were rejoicing possibly here in evil. So I think Paul is choosing his words very carefully. And I think he's stepping on a lot of toes and saying love is not the way that you've been acting. And what's so powerful about this is this list is still needed for us today as well. We may live 2,000 years past the time when Paul wrote this, but we still need to hear these words, and it's still applicable. It's still needed. We need to put this up in our homes. We need to mention this in weddings and where there's relationships. We need to be reminded of these words often. Paul closes this section by saying that love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things. Love endures all things. The language is a little bit different here. What does it mean, all things, bears all things? We might even think about the negation of this. When you say that love bears all things, love never fails to serve. Maybe that makes a little more sense to me than bearing all things. Love never fails to serve or to bear up. And that goes with this last one, that love endures all things. So love never fails to help. Love never fails to carry on. Love doesn't quit, does it? Many marriages today end after the first hint of problems. But love is a commitment that says, I'm going to continue on. Even when I face problems, we're going to work through that, and I'm going to continue to love you with my words and my actions. We see these two middle ones connects the faith and hope, these three main elements that we're going to find later in this text. But love continues to hope in all things and believe in all things, and that is central to what Paul is saying. We need to have love in all things. It never stops. The last section, Paul is going to address the fact that love is permanent. Love is permanent. And he's going to contrast that with the spiritual gifts. So allow me to read verses 8 through 13. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. And as for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Paul is going to make the point, and he makes this clearest in verse 8. He says, love never ends, love is permanent. But as for the prophecies they will pass away. As tongues, they will cease. And as for knowledge, it will pass away. Those are three of the spiritual gifts that we saw listed among the 9. And I think these are representative of the spiritual gifts as a whole. The Spirit giving the supernatural power or ability to people we find there. So those are the spiritual gifts that we're talking about. And Paul says that they are temporary. They are temporary. There's really two main ways to look at this passage here that I've seen. And so the question is this temporary regarding this age or the age to come? So is he saying that as we live through the period of the church, right, in this age, that there will come a time in this age that spiritual gifts will end or will cease? Already began the lesson saying that I don't understand spiritual gifts to continue today, certainly not like in this. I don't want to restrict God or what he can do, and so I don't want to be real dogmatic about that. But the question is, does this passage teach that spiritual gifts are going to end in the church age, or is it talking about when Jesus comes again in that transition to the age to come? Is that the ending of these spiritual gifts? That's the question. I wish I had a better answer for you than it's not exactly clear. I think it probably ends to talk about the age to come. And so we'll notice that as we move along. There are three contrasts that Paul sets up, and these are just going to emphasize each one of these elements. So first of all, there is the partial and the complete. For he says, we know in part, and we prophesy in part. We don't have all knowledge. In fact, that's how he started the chapter, right? He talked about one that did have all knowledge. And even if I were to have all knowledge and know all mysteries, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. But here he points out the fact that we know in part. We don't have full knowledge. And even when we are prophesying, speaking the word of God, we don't have full knowledge there. There are secret things that God keeps to himself. He doesn't tell us everything. He tells us what we need to know. So there is this partial. But notice what he says in verse 10, but when the perfect or the complete comes, the partial will pass away. The partial will pass away. And again, not saying whether this is this age or the age to come, but simply stating the fact that spiritual gifts are temporary. The next image he's going to use is one of a child and one that has reached maturity, or a child and an adult. Notice in verse 11, he says, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I became a man, I gave up childish things. Again, you can see this argument kind of play out both ways, right? When the church has everything that it needs in terms of revelation, when it is mature in that sense, we have the written word and no need for further revelation, there is this completeness, then we can put away the spiritual gifts. You can make that argument as well. I'm not sure if Paul was projecting or he knows exactly how long the church is going to last. I don't know if he's looking 2,000 years into the future. That's likely not his purview or what he's thinking through. So it may simply be saying that when this age is done, then when we get to be with God, when all things are perfected, when all things are complete, the consummation of the ages, we see that it is then that is the maturity that he's talking about. We also see in verse 12 that he talks about now versus then. He says, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. Here we again try to play out these two scenarios. Is this talking about this age? Well, he says, now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. To see in a mirror, they didn't have mirrors the way we have mirrors. They were not as precise. There was a lot of fuzziness. If you look in the mirror, you would get a resemblance or a somewhat of a picture, but it was not exact. It was much different than looking at someone face to face. So again, does this indicate one way or the other? It may be this face-to-face references when we are able to be and dwell with God, which would point to the age to come. But he says, we see in a mirror dimly, but then face-to-face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. Again, this part of the passage would probably lend us to look at that second option, the age to come. That is when we will see God face to face and be fully known by him, and we shall fully know. So that's not something that will come about now, although people would say that this full knowledge would come with the closing of the New Testament, right? With this age. I probably muddled that up. I hope you can see the options anyway, to see where we're going. I'm not providing a lot of answers because I'm not clear on this. I would lean toward the age to come because that's what just Paul is talking about. As I mentioned, I believe that spiritual gifts have ceased or ended, at least the way we see those expressed in the New Testament. I'm just not convinced this passage teaches that it's going to end in this age. Okay, let's ask some questions. Is your devotion to God absent of love? You can be doing a lot of things, but if you don't have love in your heart, if you're not seeking to serve others, if you're not motivated by goodwill toward other people, goodwill toward God, by devotion to him because of who he is, if you're doing a lot of the right things, but you don't have love, it's not good. It's not beneficial. You need to ask yourself, why don't I have love? Why am I just going through the motions? Why am I doing the good things, but yet I've not given my heart over completely to God? That's what's needed. Love God with all of your heart. Give him your entire being. Really, the problem when we are devoted to God but absent of love, the problem is we've given God part. We've given him some of our actions and some of our times, but we've not given him our complete self. So is your devotion to God absent of love? And if so, that's something you need to change. Secondly, is your love active or is it mere words? Again, we need to use our words to express our love and our care for other people. But it shouldn't stop at words. Love is an action. Love does something. Love refrains from hurtful actions. Love is something that needs to be done, to be carried out. Don't just say you love someone, but also show them with your actions. And everything we see in this chapter is really a reflection of who God is. 1 John 4 tells us that God is love. It's a defining characteristic, a defining trait of who he is. And so we see that God is love. And so when we're looking at this chapter, I made mention of the fact that it applies to us in many different situations. Love is still necessary and needed today. It's a reflection of the very heart and mind of God. God acts from a place of love, of seeking our benefit. Even when we are enemies, Romans chapter 5 says, Christ died on the cross for us. And he did that because of love. So we see God's perfect love can be demonstrated in how we live. We can live out a picture of who God is if we will live with love. Well, I hope this lesson has been beneficial. This is part 2 in that chapters 12 through 14 part, and we'll look at chapter 14 another time. But I hope this has been beneficial. If there's anyone here tonight that needs to obey the gospel or needs to make their life right, needs any of the help of the saints here, then please come as we stand and sing.